From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
And thank you so much for being here this afternoon. We are starting a whole program, a series on Islam and the debates that are taking place in the Muslim world today, contemporary debates. And it goes beyond Islamism. It goes looking at major issues that affect young people and the way they're approaching their world today. And in a way, to kick off this program, we have today Dr. Shireen Hunter, one of the top experts in this field worldwide. Dr. Shireen Hunter is a visiting fellow at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University since 2005. She's also a distinguished scholar at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., with which she has been associated since 1983 as director of the Islam program between 1998 and 2005, as senior associate 93 to 97, and as deputy director of the Middle East program between 1983 and 1992. She's consultant to the RAND Corporation, and she was academic fellow at Carnegie Corporation between 2000 and 2002. While at CSIS in the 1980s, she also taught courses as professorial lecturer at Georgetown University. She taught at George Mason University, and she held the Louis Goldstein Chair at Washington College in 1989. Prior to joining CSIS, Dr. Hunter was guest scholar at the Brookings Institution and research fellow at Harvard University Center for International Affairs. She's also been an Onassis Foundation Fellow at the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy in 2000, and visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies at 2004. Dr. Hunter was educated at Tehran University, where she holds a BA, and then went on to London School of Economics, where she took her master's degree in international relations, and then has completed her PhD at the Institut Universitaire de Hautes Études Internationales in Geneva. She has written extensively. Her books include, among the many, many books she has written, Islam and Human Rights, Advancing a U.S. Muslim Dialogue, which she edited in 2005, Modernization, Democracy, and Islam, which she co-edited in 2005 as well, Islam in Russia, The Politics of Identity and Security, Islam, Europe's Second Religion, published in 2002, The Future of Islam-West Relations, Clash of Civilizations or Peaceful Coexistence, published in 1998, Central Asia Since Independence, The Transcaucasus in Transitions, Iran After Khomeini, Iran and the World, Continuity in a Revolutionary Decade, The Politics of Islamic Revivalism, and the World and the Third World, Politics of Aid. These are only some of the titles of the many books that Dr. Hunter has written. And I'm going to stop now because there's much, much more to say, but you'd rather hear from her. Dr. Shireen Hunter.
Good afternoon. Now it is afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, all of you, for taking time to come here. Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, an old friend, and as ancien combattant, we call, we were in Washington for some time. working on the various Middle East issues and subject, and I don't have to say anything about her. You all know her, how wonderful she is, not as a scholar and but also as a person. I, first of all, have to give a disclaimer here. I am not actually an Islamic scholar as such. In other words, you know, if people want to get with me about the details of fiqh and usul al-fiqh and so on and so forth, I am not going to be able to answer them or let alone enter into any kind of mujadala or even munazara with them. I am essentially a student of these issues, and generally the way I study them is in relation to the other forces in society and all how they interact with the other forces in society, with the issues of power and so on and so forth. And also, you know, in the international affairs, things that are my basic disciplines, political science and international relations. Having said that, when you are studying law and even do law and political science, those days anyway, moons year, I mean, God knows how many years, I don't want to even remember ago when I was studying that, it was inevitable that you did study a certain amount of Islamic law because that was the foundation of the legal system. So I'm not totally illiterate, but by no means, so don't please take me to task on that. The work that I have done also in this book that hopefully I have been promised that it will be out by June, and so I am still holding them to that, if not June, though that hopefully July or whatever, is essentially I am the overall editor and, you know, putting the conceptual framework, and I have written the chapter on Iran, but there are other people who have, because there's no way that a single person can cover the entire Islamic world, and whoever claims that, obviously it has to be very superficial. And I think that it is the scholars that are writing about it are all extremely well established, and I think that it would be a very useful book to read, but at the same time both useful, inspiring, but in some ways, as the report also will say, at the same time to some extent somewhat also disappointing. The basic focus on this is the question of reformist Islam. Now, first of all, I have to say that even the very word reform is obviously a very contested term in Islam. What do you mean by reform? We have these concepts of reform, islah, or a renewal, tajdeed, or whatever in Islam from early time. But like many other concepts in Islam, this is the beauty of it in some ways, but also the problems that it causes, is that there is not a 100% agreed upon understanding what all these things mean. And so there are different conceptions of reform. For example, if you are a very conservative literalist Muslim, you want by reform, you mean that any kind of exogenous influence that might have come into Islam, which they considered contamination by other cultures and so on, whether it was local practices or whatnot, you have to take them away. And that is one wave of reform that you see. But that is not the kind of reform that here I am talking about when I talk about reformist Islam, what they mean by reform. The concept that I talk about reform, and all the authors also are approaching it in this form, is that essentially the debate that emerged in the Islamic world in the 19th century, I would say that by the mid-19th century. And the reason for that essentially was the encounter, and of course Islam was not the only religion that had to face this. I think Christianity also faced this, the neo-theology and Reformation and other issues that, again, I'm not enough knowledgeable about it to talk here. But basically this was because of the challenge that, if you want to call it modernity, essentially posed both to Islam as a religious but intellectual and civilizational construct, and at the same time, the carriers of modernity, the European powers, and the way they entered into the Islamic world, it actually also posed an existential challenge to the survival of Muslim societies as independent entities. And I think that this generated in the Muslim world, I think that a process of intellectual questioning, self-criticism, other criticism, in other words, criticizing the other, and trying to find out, to begin with, why is that this happened to the Muslim countries? Because when you look at the Islamic world and the Western world, I'm not going to talk about the Dark Ages and Golden Age of Islam and so on. Everybody knows this, and it has become a bit hackneyed to talk about that. But when you really look to see that up until about, I would say that the beginning, up until about early, almost I could say, that 18th century, you see that basically the Islamic world and the Muslim world are more or less of the same strength, those parts that were in contact with the West. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was still a power to be reckoned with. They almost took over Vienna if the Poles had not come to rescue, which they did, to their credit. The Safavid Empire was still standing, weakened, but still standing, and the Europeans were courting them, and so on and so forth. And other areas, of course, that they were not in the heartland of Islamic world, the situation was different. But what is it that, as some of the later reformist thinkers in Islam asked, is that why is it that this Islamic world became, as they call it, colonizable? Because there has been a lot of criticism of colonialism and how it affected, and it did affect very negatively the Islamic world. But one question that has not been often asked, although frequently asked, but perhaps not as often as it should, is that why was that the Muslim world colonized? Because it's like, if you are, why do you catch cold and somebody else doesn't while you're exposed to the same virus? Because one immune system is strong and the other person's immune system is not strong. And so this is essentially what was that, these questions that they were asking. And I think that this is still the question that Muslim world has not really yet even gotten an answer to that. And we see in this context that you see a different kind of debate occurs within the Islamic world. And obviously you have those that I don't want to talk about them right now because they're not out of this, out of the context of this talk, but which said that the only way Muslim countries can remedy their situation is that to 100% emulate the West, and going as far as like Atatürk did, changing even to some degree the language and alphabet and so on and so forth, and other countries that had for a long time what I call this sort of modernizing projects, but without, however, accepting the fundamental philosophical foundations of modernity. The more emancipatory dimensions of modernity, the rule of reason and the freedom of this and that and so on, which of course it took a long time to be established even in Europe itself. Now, at that time, however, they were another kind of Muslim reformers. And then you had the so-called rejectionists. Those were saying that the reasons Muslim became like that was because they had abandoned Islam. And if they could only go back to the true teachings of Islam, what Islam was, later on we have, people like Sayyid Qutb and others, and Ma'adudi and others say the same thing. They existed in the early 19th century as well. But then you have this more sophisticated, if I may say so, Muslim intellectuals, some of them among clerics, and they come up, and some of them frankly, adopted this discourse out of, I think that, um, realized that no other discourse is going to succeed. And what they said, he said that we have to go back to the true Islam. But what was the true Islam? The true Islam, they said, is not the ossified Islam and the closed ijtihad and so on that since, at least 10th century, but if you want to be very generous, you could say that definitely since 14th century has been fed to Muslim people, which we have no idea that what is its direct relationship with the Quran. Is this, we have to take fiqh or the views of fuqaha as really being also equal to the word of God and so on. And this is where you came into this new thinking, reformist thinking, and that was to say that we have to look in a different way to Islam and to realize that Islam is a very rational religion, and that Islam is a very scientific religion, and that so on and so forth and so forth. And this is where you have people like, for example, Jamaluddin Afghani, or you have, of course, Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, who is probably, although he was the disciple of Afghani, but they parted company later on, but definitely, so they come and say that if Islam wants to be revived, but also most importantly, if Islam wants to survive, that is what their view was, that we have to reform it in a sense of not, as even some of the current reformist thinkers said, to mend it, because there's nothing been corrupted that needs to be mended, but just to rediscover what the true meaning of it was. And they kept saying, he says that why is it that the religion that produced those scholars, those philosophers, those scientists and so on, Al-Khwarizmi, for example, nobody knows that the word logarithm comes from the corruption of the name of Al-Khwarizmi, for example, or Jabr or whatever. And then, there's so much of it. And so what happened that they didn't, they just, and they came to conclusion that part of it was because they close the gates or the abwab al-ijtihad, they closed those because they did not allow anymore. They said whatever Imam Shafi'i said, that's it, and you can only a little bit here and there to find out which one of the interpretation is correct, but you can't move anything. So what we are seeing that is happening now, which started since the 19th century, this new spirit of reform means a much more rationalist approach to study of Islam and to the interpretation of Islam. So here we have, of course, this is nothing new. We have had this from the early beginning of Islam. We had the differences between, you may call it Ahlul Hadith or Ahlul Rai, but essentially the difference between Naql or Rawayat, which is something that has been said that the Prophet said, and so on and so forth through various things. And the other thing is that to really look at the text, to Quran, and to read it as God told you, read, Aqra, and to find out with reason, what is it that it is telling to you right now? And so this is one thing, and I think that we could see, oh yes, sorry, I apologize, that this is one thing that we see was started quite early on in Islam, was forgotten for a while, and in fact, I don't want to get into details because I'm running out of time, but the fact is that it's starting already, and it nevertheless, this rationalist thinking within Islam remained. It's not like that it suddenly had been completely closed. It existed, it remained. But it really began to acquire a new life with Abduh particularly, because Afghani later became more of a political agitator than a really scholar. But at any way, and their followers and so on and so forth, and it survived. So what we are seeing that the reformist Islam, as opposed to the Islamist, particularly reading of Islam, which is a very narrow, very literalist, and sometimes also even selective. I don't want to get into details of it, but sometimes when I see people who want to give credence to their opinion and they quote a verse of the Quran, then I go and check it against the verse itself. I see that they have omitted part of it, because if they had given the full verse, it would not have supported their position. So this type of things they are doing. Against that, we have this more rationalist, which is one of the characteristics of the reformist discourse today, is the more rationalist thing, and the view that the Quran is an eternal book, but that you have the reading of the Quran is not an eternal thing, because it has to be done by people, through people. And so this is one element that the reformists maintain, that if we want to see what we should do, what the Quran really is saying, we have to apply reason, rationalism, but also particularly the rationalism of the time. This is one element of that. And I think this started then, and I'm not going to say why this thing did not continue. Part of it was that basically, certainly since the 1920s, a secularizing authoritarian secularism and top-down secularization and developmentalist projects took hold. And unfortunately, one of the characteristics of this developmentalist projects was that they concentrated on physical sort of modernization, but they did not take the other elements of modernity together, which was freedom of speech, freedom to think, freedom to reason, and they narrowed the field of discourse, and consequently, I think that you couldn't have any other discourses, whether it was traditional Islamic or reformist Islamic, and I think that this, in many ways, I don't want to get into too much. Maybe if somebody asks the question, I'll be happy to answer. This really, in a way, nipped in the bud a lot of the Islamic reformist discourse that was going on at the time. And they were kind of silenced, and I think that also led to other reactions that strengthened the conservative Islam. The other question that has been very important, again, historically, obviously, is that what aspects of that we have, even in the Quran, but obviously much more so in the Islamic law, how much of those are eternal and are really God saying, and in fact, if some people, believe it, that existed even before the advent of the age of prophecy, and certainly the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the other thing is obviously that how much of it, some of it, is indeed eternal, everlasting, no compromise on others, and how much of it was bound by a particular time and bound by a particular space. And including regarding the number of the ayahs in the Quran, is that which one of them really address to questions that are eternal, principles that are eternal, and how much of it was revealed to the Prophet because of certain circumstances. And this is called, depending on sabab al-nuzul or asbab al-nuzul or sha'n al-nuzul, whatever you want to say. This basically making a Quran as well as an eternal and divine text, nevertheless also a historical text, has been one of the issues that has, again, was indeed since the time of early Islam, and of course the much maligned Mu'tazili and all that. But the issue is nevertheless, to these days, is very, very important. And this comes whether, for example, somebody that's like some literalist or say that even if you are in Indonesia and for centuries you have been dressing according to your local customs, suddenly after 600 years since you have been Muslims, they tell you to be true Muslim, you have to dress in a particular way, in white or whatever, and your beard has to be a certain length. Otherwise, now, this neither reason really justifies this, because if Islam is a universal religion, you know, it was not, Prophet of Islam did not come only to the Arabs of Hijaz, because maybe in Najd they were dressing differently, or in other places, even in Jaziratul Arab, they were dressing differently. Plus, we don't know exactly how the Prophet was dressing. There is no record of saying that what was the size of Prophet's beard. You see what I'm trying to say? So these are the issues, but unfortunately, this may sound very kind of a very trivial subject, but this is very, very important. Because if some aspects of Islam were bound by time and space, and also a number of Islamic law, including stuff that is in the Quran, were essentially the ratification of the urf of the time. So do they have the same kind of divinity, which means that you cannot touch them, even though the circumstances have changed? Although in Islam fiqh, at least in Shia fiqh, you have the rule that if the subject has changed, the asl has changed, the araz will change as well. So for instance, you know, if a woman didn't work, so consequently she didn't have any, you know, like her, what they call it, inheritance had to be had. But what if today in Muslim world you have women who not only work, but they are the sole supporter of their family? Can you deal with this woman the same way that you dealt with, you know, other kind of things? And the other thing is that this is, of course, something that is very disturbing to many very, very orthodox or strict Muslims, is that which, you know, this element of historical kind of history boundedness or context boundedness of some of the element of Islam. But for example, though, that if you wanted, let's say, to run an economy, a lot of people talk about Islamic economy and so on, but if you wanted to run an economy really based on only Islamic rules about whether it is ownership and other things, a whole number of things cannot be done. And this is, some of it is now, you know, in Iran, I have to add in here, the reason, because they have a government who is claiming that wants to run everything according to Islam, these debates are coming up and are causing, obviously, a lot of debate and so forth. So the reformists that we have now said that we cannot really understand Islam unless we have to keep in mind the context and the time within which some of its revelation has come about. And this particularly reflect not the things that relate to the matters of worship. Obviously, if you don't believe in the prophecy of Muhammad, you cannot say I'm a Muslim. If you don't believe that Quran is a divine book, then you cannot be a Muslim. Or if you don't believe in the Day of Judgment and so on and so forth, and you cannot be a Muslim. So there are some things that, you know, are. And you cannot also deny that there are certain duties demanded from you. You have to fast, you have to. But that doesn't mean that you will not be a Muslim if you didn't fast. But it means that you will be a bad Muslim. And then, of course, you will get your... Now, even here, people are saying that there are some conflicts also in some of the injunctions of Islam, which, again, these debates existed in the early days of Islam as well. One of the things, and then I'm going to try to limit it maybe another few minutes and wrap it up. But from the very beginning, we have in Islam a very important, in my opinion, concept, which means that there is no compulsion in faith. La ikraha fi din. I mean, in general, Islam does not, it's not, although, you know, the view is that Islam is a sword and they keep it there and say, you either become a Muslim or you die. But when you go beyond the early spread of Islam, Islam is spread mostly by the, you know, traders and by, I don't know, preachers and so on and so forth. There was not the element of, so compulsion in Islam is not true. For example, the question of forced marriage. I know this because we studied at Faculty of Law in one of our classes the question of nikah. Forced marriage, that nikah is illegal. If a woman is forced to accept a man, really forced, you know, and has no say in that, and they say it because the father likes it and so on, that man still will be haram, will be now mahram to her, because woman has to do it with her own free will. So there isn't compulsion as such. And yet we have, even today, the problem of apostasy. And the fact that, you know, somebody can be, again, you know, this depends what aspect of Islam, particularly in this day and age, which whether we like it or not, certain concepts of human right and human dignity and so on has become part of, I'm not saying that it always is respected, but has become part of what some of the Iranian reformist thinkers say has become part of the humanities urf. And since Islam says we have to take into account urf, so these are also to be incorporated within Islam and so on. So the problem becomes here is that you have this very open thing. It says that there's no compulsion in faith. You cannot, we have shown you, he says, the road, and you are free to choose. If you want to choose damnation, that's your business. And I can tell you, I can, you know, enjoin you to good and say that please choose this and don't do the other thing. But I cannot force you and then to say you are kafir. This is what this is to God. So these are some of the issues that are actually are debated today among the Muslim thing. And there are other aspects as well. And it says that, for example, what is more important in Islam? Is it merely the ritualistic dimensions of it, some of which we don't know how actually was early on? Or is it that what was the purpose of Islam? What was the goal of the Prophet? He wanted to create a society of justice. He wanted to create a society, relatively egalitarian society. There are, as far as I know, and this shows obviously my limited knowledge, there are few religions that in the holy book so openly says, "Inna akramakum indallah atqakum." The most noblest of you in the eyes of God are the most pious. In other words, no racism, no nothing. So they say, therefore, in our endeavors in our life, what is it that we have to be concerned with? Whether a woman shows her face, which is actually open to be shown, and or has to wear niqab, or rather to make sure that woman and man are treated fairly, and that they have, you know. So I think that today we are having this new discourse, a new interpretation of Islam, which if I were to say that from Iran to Southeast Asia and so on, and Turkey, what are some of the common things that bring these people together, the reformist thinkers, despite the differences that they may have? One is that we have to have a rationalist approach to Islam. As in Iran, they call it Islam aqlani. The other thing is that we have to keep context in mind. And because otherwise Islam will become irrelevant to the current day. If you want to keep Islam alive, you have to keep the context. And you have people like, for example, Mohammed Talbi, also the Tunisian, who goes quite far in this thing. So it is rationalist, it is contextualist. The other most important thing, which I think that this has been everywhere, is that we have to look at what are actually the true goals of the Islamic path, Sharia, the Islamic path. And this is, again, is nothing new, goes to 14th century and so on. What are the al-maqasid al-Sharia? What is it that we want to achieve with this? So Sharia in itself as such is not sacred. If today you cannot establish justice by behaving the way the Caliph did in, 10th century or 11th century, that it will not be following the Prophet's Sharia or the Quran's path if you apply the same rule. Because the maqsad, the goal of the Sharia was that it should be just, it should be merciful, it should protect the human nafs and aql and mal and whatever and all that. So this is another thing, the goal-oriented, or as the Iranian reformist Kadivar said, Islam qayatgara, the goal-oriented Islam rather than ritualistic Islam. And the last but not least is the fact that they say we have also to create an Islam which is right-centered, haq mahvari, right-centered, not merely duty-centered. We shouldn't just talk about what are man's duty towards God, but we also have to say what rights God has given to man. Now, there are various, scholars approach this in a different way, but this is what they are saying. Now, what do I see as outlook for this reformist Islamic discourse? Unfortunately, I am not very optimistic. A few years back, I would have been more optimistic. Reformist discourse suffers from, I say, three basic challenges or impediments. One, any kind of complex discourse is difficult to spread. Alexis de Tocqueville said that a false but simple idea will always have more weight than a correct but complicated idea. Une idée simple mais fausse aura plus toujours de force qu'une idée juste mais compliquée. So the message of, in general, synthesis, which is the reformist Islam, is very difficult. Black and white it is. You can be extreme secularist and throw the Quran into the whatever dustbin of history or whatever, or just nothing can be changed. This is one thing. The other thing is that reformists are suspected both by secularists and by conservatives. The secularists think that they are, a wolf in sheep's clothes, and the reformists think that they are kafir and mulhad, and they want to destroy, and that some of them are actually declared apostates and have to go to exile and to live abroad and what have you. But the other thing is that in general, the closed political systems of most Muslim countries doesn't allow enough room for discourse. And in many of the Muslim countries now, Islamic institutions, Islam is either what you call official Islam, the Diyanat and the Ministry of Religious Affairs and this and that, who would say whatever the government wants, and they will give you any fatwa, like in the old days, Khalif wanted something, and a jurist would find their, kolah shari, they say in Farsi, a religious hat for it and make it acceptable. Or they are in absolute opposition, be it whether Islamist or an active opposition, or be it quiescent and a kind of a passive opposition. So the closeness of the discourse, the field of discourse, also I think that is working against the reformists. You just have to see to the fate of reformists in Iran, to see how when you have, not this rule of open debate is accepted, how any kind of idea, including Islamic reformist discourse, becomes. The last thing is that I have to say is how we in the West can help the reformists. To begin with, we have to not to think that if the reformist version of Islam gains influence in the whole Muslim world, that a lot of the problems between the Islamic world and the West will disappear. Because many of these have nothing to do with Islam. And so even if you have absolute, secularists, as we did, 50 years ago, whatever, you're still going to have problems. This is one. The other thing is that the worst thing that could happen to reformist Muslims is to be seen that they are somehow, already some people are saying this, attacking it. I read an article just about when I was finishing this that was attacking a sort of a hermeneutics of the Quran and the other Islamic sources as being a colonialist design to undermine Islam. So I think that they are facing a lot of challenges, but on the other hand, I think that this perhaps offers, I think really the best way for Muslim countries to finally find a way of digesting, if I may put it that way, digesting and nativizing modernity, without which they cannot really enter the modern age. And so I'm sorry I went on a bit long, but I hope that I could sketch at least some of the basic outlines of the debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. And now the floor is open for questions. We have about 15 minutes. And
I tried to be very, very short. Sorry. Yes, please.
What's sexual behavior like in Islamic countries? Is there polygamy? Is there pornography?
Well, to be honest with you, I cannot give you actually country by country. I'm sorry. Yes, I am trying to. Sorry. I cannot give you a. Oh, you didn't hear the question. It says that what is the sexual behavior in Muslim countries? Is there polygamy and is there pornography? I think that, first of all, I cannot give you a, because I haven't done field research. I'm not a sociologist, but obviously there are some polygamous, there is some polygamous behavior in the Muslim world, as there are monogamous behavior, to the extent that also depends how do you define monogamy and polygamy. But I don't want to get into details, but you can be legally monogamous, but actually practically not. So, but definitely there is. And whether there is pornography or not, I don't think that there is the kind of pornography that we see. There aren't sex shops, as far as I know, or countries that I have visited openly, or topless bar and things like that. But if you think that some young Muslim will, read on the cover, a copy of Playboy or the equivalent of that, or they do it nowadays increasingly through internet and so on, I'm sure that there are incidents of that, definitely. Of course, prostitution, well, that unfortunately never disappeared, and it exists, and I think that in a way it's always going to exist, and that's, yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
The structure that you present
Mm-hmm.
in terms of revelation, and reason, and secularism, and emancipation is mirrored quite impressively in the history of modern Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
But in the history of modern Judaism, a reaction to modernity and to emancipation was a major, major thrust in terms of historicism, historical consciousness,
Right.
and historical research.
That's right.
Could you say very briefly,
Right.
give us an idea, what role that has in the evolving dynamic that we present?
It has a very great importance and a great dynamic. In fact, one of the things that some of the reformist thinkers are saying that we have to study the history of evolution of Islam, and to see that, for instance, how much of some of the things that we think are the actually eternal truths of Islam were kind of historical accretions and because of the practices and so on. And the other thing is that they make a distinction between what they call, at least one reformist Iranian makes this distinction very clearly, and that is Mr. Kadivar. He makes a distinction between what he calls the historical Islam In other words, the practices of that happened in Muslim countries over the years, whether it is in politics and so on, which a lot of it were not really indigenous to Islam. They were taken, like for example, the notion of monarchy did not exist in Islam, whereas later on, however, you see that caliphs really essentially turned into either Persian or Byzantine emperors and so on. So there is this, and so they make a distinction between what they call the historical Islam and what he calls it spiritual or what I said goal-oriented Islam. What was the original message of that Prophet wanted to give? So I think that they are, and they say that we have to look into a variety of this. First, the historical conditions under which actually Islam emerged, and the historical conditions under different regions that it evolved. And yes, this is a big issue, yes. In fact, one Tunisian reformist author has written a book that translated, I think it has been recently translated into English, but it's the Quran between the message and history. So there is very much of that going on, yes. Yes, sir. Oh, David, yes. No, it's all right, both of you. No, go ahead.
My question has kind of two parts. It relates to the proposed apostasy law
Uh-huh.
the Majlis is considering.
Yes.
And it refers to conversion from Islam
Mhm.
by an adult. It also refers to children of a couple where one is a Muslim and one
Mhm.
is not a Muslim, and that the child must become Muslim or will be considered an apostate.
That's right.
And so one is the question of the origin of this and
That's
why
it.
now.
Yes.
And number two is the expectation of the Baha'i community.
Mm-hmm.
This will be applied to them retroactively, even for those who converted from Islam generations ago.
Mm-hmm.
How will this
Well, first of all, I saw that today as well, and it was very distressing. This is, I believe, it is the kind of, if you want, the revenge of the hardliners or conservatives in Iran against what they saw as so-called excesses of the reformists. Because you have a number of very high-ranking clerics, including, for example, Ayatollah Sanei, who has been target of a lot of attacks lately, who basically say that there is no such a thing, as irtad, apostasy, and he puts the emphasis on the whole no compulsion in faith. The other thing also, of course, those people who say that irtad currently cannot be justified is that even in the limited case that it existed in the early times of Islam, was against those people who converted to Islam in order to get into community and then spy against it and undermine it. So I think, I hope that this will not pass. This legislation will not pass. But also, legislations that pass can also be exactly. But this is one of the major issues, and I address this in the book, and all reformists are against this. The whole question of apostasy. The problem of the Baha'is, of course, is a real problem for them, and I don't want to get into that, but this has also been very much mixed up with various politics in Iran and now, and it is very unfortunate because ordinary people, suffer as a result of it. And this is to me personally, it's very distressing because it shows, but then, all this, there are a lot of articles against this reformists that, as I mentioned, that accuse them that they are kind of trying to destroy Islam from within. And that in some ways they say that they are worse than the secularists, because the secularists, at least we know what they want, but these people are claiming that they are Muslims and they are presenting the true Islam. The gentleman in the back here.
My question is, despite all this negativism or some alarmists saying Islam is bad, this and that, Islam remains to be one of the fastest growing religions
Mhm.
We have almost 22 million Muslims in Europe, and after the euphoria settles down, most of them happen to be just like you and I, working class. It's not that much attached to even Islam, but just struggle with their daily life, how to survive, how to live, sending their kids to schools. Can you talk about that aspect of Islam, for example, the integration of Muslims from Africa, Asia, and Southeast Asia, and even Middle East coming to countries?
Europe, yeah. Well,
September 11 also, there are a lot of Americans who voted for Islam.
mhm.
And
Right. Well, that is obviously a very interesting issue. And again, here too, you have the kind of reformist thinking of that have certain advice for the Muslim communities that are abroad, and the more strict thinkers, and even some obviously want to recreate the Islamic State even in Europe. I mean, Hizb ut-Tahrir at least says that they want to create Khilafat in Oxford. How? I don't know. But they were, believe me, a number of them. I saw them. But I think that what is interesting is that some of the religious leaders that are kind of in between. They are not exactly 100% reformists in the sense of really into rationalism and contextualism and a major rehauling of certain aspects of Islamic law, for example, the criminal penal law, hudud and whatever, or women's issue. Because on the politics and so on, everybody wants representative government and so on. That is not the issue. The problem in the Muslim world is about women, whether how much they have to cover or how they can go and so on, and also sometimes the penal code and apostasy and things like that. So, but what is happening is that some of the, I would call traditional clergy, but which nevertheless have a more open mind and that are more prone to see the circumstances and then, issue opinions and so on, guidance that takes the new circumstances into account. And this is why, for example, the Fiqh Council of Europe, and that Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi is in charge of that, and others, they have been developing what they call al-fiqh al-aqalliya, the minorities fiqh. And basically that Europe and others also are talking about that Europe and America and so on is not Darul Harb, it's not but it is a Darul Mu'ahida or Darul Aman, and so they have to follow the law of the land and so on and so forth. So I think that in some ways they are, I shouldn't say this maybe, but they, in some way they are more gradually moving to be accommodationist than the Archbishop of Canterbury, who says we have to have Sharia law. In the UK. So I think that there are this kind of, circumstances. There is, the presence of, particularly in Europe, Muslim communities there and new circumstances that has been created has led not so much to really a wholesale effort of reinterpretation, but except recently, but by issuing various fatwas and opinions on certain circumstances. For example, I was reading, this Ayatollah Montazeri's website. All of these people now have websites, and some partly small ones are even in English, so one can actually go in there as well. And there was one, I think, woman from France or whatever had written to him that what should she do, because they won't allow her to go to school or to work without hijab. And of course, his conception of hijab is that face and so on is, in other words, if you are not wearing something very form-fitting and whatever, and you have a headscarf, not even the very strict one, then that's okay. So because there are even moderation in the terms of hijab and whatever. And then the fatwa that he gave, he said that as far as hair is concerned, he suggested that she wear a wig, which, it's a very nice way of going over it. And the other thing that she said, as far as working, he said, if you could move to another country that you can live and work reasonably without having to abandon your Islamic, then do that. But if you cannot, then you have to make the necessary compromises. So it is the sort of zarurat, the necessity also comes into it. So Islam is essentially flexible. What is important is the interpreters. And whether these interpreters want to make life easy for Muslims, or they want to keep this hold on them. You see what I mean? It's like in the old days, like, you couldn't have the Bible in any other language. Why Latin was so sacred? Bible was not written in Latin. I mean, it should have been in Aramaic, for example. You see what I'm trying to say? So it's a little bit the debates, so that element that prevents this kind of, so if you have actually an enlightened mujtahid, an enlightened mufti or whatever, these things can be resolved without actually having said that violated the rule as such. This is where also that, when I was at Faculty of Law, when we used to, this is Shia fiqh, I'm sorry, I have to make, because some of you are more familiar with that. But when we used to talk about a certain legal thing, about the interpretation, tafsir, I was always taught that there are two kinds of tafsir. There is tafsir muzayyak. In other words, you have a very narrow margin within which you can interpret the law or the rule, or you have tafsir muwassa. So the same thing applies to some of these rules. You want to make life easy, or you want to make it difficult. You want to use, for example, the question of hijab to prevent a woman from getting a work done. I don't care. I think this is a personal choice. But not if wearing of hijabs makes a woman dysfunctional. I mean, if you cannot see anything and you can hardly move, how can a woman be a doctor and wear niqab and all the burqa and so forth? But if it is that you want a woman to dress modestly, then that's another matter. We can find ways of doing that. The lady, that's why I said.
Well, I was wondering, is there any representative voice, and I think the answer is probably a quick no, but of those who might say that the Quran, or consider the Quran as a purely historical document? And secondly, is there anyone in history that you can think of who might go in that direction, like someone like Spinoza or something?
Well, I think that, some of this is, however, one of the red lines that if you really cross that red line, then you basically also say Islam, is a sect or a cult or whatever. So the divine nature of Islam and the fact that the message of Islam was uncreated, Qadim, existed, even before Prophet ever came and so on, is something that no believing Muslim can question. So because if you question that, then you might as well, say, but the Mus'haf, which is a different thing, the thing that the message has been written on it is created. But this also, some people think not. And some people even debated, this is one of the causes of the mihna, in the time of Al-Mu'tasim, because of the, Khalif Al-Ma'mun promoted the Mu'tazili, who were saying that the Mus'haf, the written Quran, is created. And the others were saying not only the Mus'haf is not created, any publication of Quran is also not created, but even reading it is uncreated. But now I think that some people, that's what gets into very, how many angels and so on, that it is that Quran is both qadim, but also hadith. In other words, it's qadim because the message pre-existed, it's divine, but it is hadith, it is historical because it occurred in a particular historical, context, and then it was written and so on, and there are various sayings. But if you just say that Quran is a historical document, you become like Pushkin, who said Islam is nothing but a combination of old stories and new lies. So we cannot go as far as that.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Hunter. It's been a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for coming. And we'll let you know. You can always check on our webpage, this division's webpage, for the upcoming programs. And thank you all for coming today. Thanks. That was wonderful. It was a great talk. So we go for lunch. Okay. But
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.